Welcome in or welcome back. We are here for a movie review of Rambo Last Blood. Rambo Last Blood was written by Matthew Cyrilnik. I am not sure exactly the pronunciation on that name. And Sylvester Stallone. It was directed by Adrian Grunberg. And it is, of course, starring Sylvester Stallone. Now, whenever looking at the key ingredients for a Sylvester Stallone piece, I think it's probably necessary at this point to go ahead and take all of that with a grain of salt and a heavy dose of grade A Stallone, because probably Stallone's, might we say, enhanced hands were probably all over the production of this thing at every level. He is notoriously, I wouldn't say, he's notoriously alpha. We'll say it that way. In his career and his career choices and paths. So to say that Sylvester Stallone was involved in many of the levels of production of this film probably is not an understatement. But what we're going to have here is best scene, worst scene, and the Oscar goes to, followed by a discussion of the film, and wrapping things up with a rating and recommendation based on the film itself. The first thing to get to is the best scene. And, pardon me, I have to say that action movies probably expose me for being a bit of a psychopath, because in movies like this where a bunch of stuff happens that I've never seen before and it's super violent, my reaction is to laugh, and I don't know what that says about me. But there's a scene where, and spoilers, this whole thing is full spoilers. I want that to be out there up front, because we're only talking about the movie if you've seen it or you don't care about spoilers. In the Rambo death trap, a guy falls onto rotary spikes and is impaled several ways and is undoubtedly dead. He's done for. Rambo happens upon him and goes ahead and puts 13 bullets in him anyway. I don't know why I liked that, but it is quite possibly the most Rambo thing that could be put, well, besides the 50 cal at point blank range, the most Rambo thing that could ever be put to celluloid, which obviously it wasn't put to celluloid, but a phrase nonetheless. The worst scene, and I think that it's only the worst scene because while and whereas it is necessary for this movie to be real, I think it's extremely unrealistic that when Rambo brazenly happens upon a compound of the worst people, they go ahead and rough him up but let him live. And this happens to be while a journalist is watching. Not realistic. Obviously, this is Hollywood. You can get away with that. For me, it sort of took me out of things, considering what types of people these people really are that he went down there to attack, and it was obvious that he went down there to attack them, and they let him live. It's not realistic that they let him live, but it is necessary to the movie, so you kind of have to let it pass. You have to let it slide. You have to let it slide, but that is not to say that you have to like it. The Oscar in this movie, and while it is extremely tempting to go ahead and say the best performance in this movie is Sylvester Stallone, considering that he gave what seemed to be an accurate portrayal of a character, a continuation of a character that he played for the first time nearly 40 years ago. Think about that, nearly 40 years ago. It is insane that he is able to give what feels like a genuine John Rambo performance 40 years later, even if John Rambo is not the most nuanced of characters. He's not up there acting Shakespearean, but it still feels like the same character. I think that the best performance in this movie has to be given to Yvette Monreal. I have no idea if that's actually how you say her name. Yvettemonreal. I imagine that's how you say it. But if that character is not sympathetic, if that character is not someone that you feel for, if that character is not someone whom you enjoy seeing on screen for holistic reasons, not just because she's drop dead gorgeous, then the movie doesn't really work. The mechanism which has to be there for you to root for Rambo is the fact that these drug traffickers, this cartel, has not... They didn't even murder her. What they did was something worse than that, and then she died anyway. That portrayal has to be sufficiently sympathetic, A, that you're willing to sign on to whatever Rambo wants to do to other people, which if you're sitting in the movie theater for a Rambo film, you've pretty much signed off for, but also that the first 2 acts of the movie are worth sitting through. Because, to be quite honest, for someone like me who is a fan of Stallone, a fan of Rambo, a fan of action, a fan of seeing all of these, it's hard to say innovative, but different things on film, I would have been fine with going to the theater and seeing an hour and a half of that 3rd act. It'd have been fine with me. But Yvette Monreal really is good at her role. She really does sell it. She really is something worth watching on the screen. And before we get into the discussion of this film, I have to say this, and stay with me here. I don't care about your politics. I don't care. I'm here to talk about a movie. I'm here to talk about a movie that no one really has any business trying to bring politics into. I'm here, well, and that's hard even to say because it's hard to say that because Rambo is something that is bathed in the blood of politics. If we can go that deep with it, Rambo, were it not for politics, would never have existed. That said, all of the politics that were... I say I don't care about your politics, but I'm going to go into it anyway a little bit. All of the politics that were discussed around this film have no bearing, because they were obviously spouted off by people who hadn't seen the movie. There's one trope that is, the white savior trope. Okay, that's in there. Now, do we get to just say that anytime the hero is white? But moving past that, the story isn't great, but it's enough for a Rambo film. The first Rambo was a movie. Every consequent Rambo has been an action movie, and that's okay. That is not... An apology is not needed for that. This series is what this series is. It's about someone who has been deeply affected by the things that they have seen and been through, and is even, at the end of his life, suffering through those things, trying to cope with those things. And this is, to a large extent, and I'm going to get into a little bit more about this in a minute, but this movie is about John Rambo's struggles. More so, perhaps, than any of the other films, you sort of see John Rambo buying in to something better, accepting that perhaps the world does have something for him, that there is something he can do and be accountable for besides being this merchant of pain and terror that he spent 40 years being. and in a way that is almost transcending paternal, if that makes any sense. John Rambo seems to serve as an uncle, but predominantly a father figure, and one that is very... I spent a lot of time listening to Christopher Hitchens, and one of the rallying cries that he has against religion is that one of the ideas he hates about God is that God is a father who never moves out of the way. He says that his role as a father is to prepare his children for life and make sure that they are able to lead their own. That is how he raised his kids. Those are the assumptions under which he raised his children. This Rambo figure in this movie seems to be sort of overlording. Not directly... There's a scene where he's trying to give Yvette Monroe... And I'm sorry, I forget... The characters in this are decent, but their names are not memorable. The Yvette character... He tries to give her a letter opener that is a really gnarly-looking knife. And he's just disconnected. He is so far removed that his presence and guidance is... This is symbolism that his presence and guidance are, to some extent, worthless, but not valueless. He is holding the value of Yvette's character, but the worth of something such as a letter opener simply is not there. It is expired. This is John Rambo in a world where he has expired, which is why much of the story is channeled through a different world, through a world run by drug cartels. And this is a theme that comes up repeatedly through the Rambo series, if you care to go back and look at it. And something that I don't think Rambo gets a lot of credit for, if that makes sense. Look, here's an argument that I want to bring for Rambo, for movies like Rambo. Literature is in the eyes of the reader. Literature is through the mind of the reader. It is very simple to sit down with Macbeth and see the literature therein. Something like Rambo, it takes a little more work, which means it is the consumer which must put in a little more work. To say that something is completely devoid of literature is a blight on the speaker himself, his or herself. That is a fault in the reader, not the text. So that's just sort of where I am with the story here. But one thing, I am a bit confused still about Rambo's relation to Maria. Gabrielle, that's Yvette's character's name, I think. Maria is Gabrielle's real aunt. And when all hell breaks loose, she's very quick to leave Rambo, which suggests, A, that she had no real business being there in the first place, so I'm not sure what she was doing, but B, that she is not, in fact, Rambo's companion, which there was very little to suggest, but we might have been able to read into that as to ascertain her role in Rambo's life. Moving on from that, though, we find John Rambo breaking horses. This seems to be what he's doing. This seems to be how he's making his money. One of the key lines in the movie, which is overt in its meaning, is where John Rambo refers to his pills as keeping the lid on all the bad stuff. And that's overt, and that's on purpose, right? That is one of the messages that is supposed to get out to the audience, that everyone is supposed to take from this film. That one of the only ways someone who has been through as much and seen as many things and is as capable of as many things as John Rambo, one of the only ways that they are able to cope with that in a modern society is to keep the lid on it with medication. Fine. Absolutely. That is an overt message of the film. But where we find John Rambo is breaking horses, is keeping the lid on stallions, and teaching them the ways of domestication. This is a metaphor for John Rambo. And again, in those moments before all hell breaks loose, what's one of the last things John Rambo does? John Rambo goes ahead and rounds up the horses that he still has on his farm and sets them loose. And those stallions run wild. That's a beautiful little moment. And that's something I haven't seen. So I don't always travel down the YouTube sphere for movie reviews after seeing one anymore. I think that really movie reviewing on YouTube has come down to one channel, and that channel is Red Letter Media. And unfortunately, I don't know if they reviewed this movie. I haven't looked it up yet. But I did do a little bit of traveling down the YouTube algorithm for Rambo reviews, and they leave a lot to be desired. And this is the level on which they leave a lot to be desired. They do not go into these minutiae of this film, the little things that stick out. Sylvester Stallone setting the stallions free before he breaks loose on a couple of bad guys. That has to give you a nostalgia hard-on for all things Hollywood, if nothing else in this film will. That little wink to the audience of Sylvester Stallone setting the stallions, Italian stallion, of Sylvester Stallone setting the stallions to run free before he breaks open a can of whoop-ass. Cracks open a can of whoop-ass. That has to do something for you. That is cinema. That's Hollywood. One of the comments that does often appear on these reviews is a reference to Logan. John Campion notably says, "Is this Logan?" No, it's not. Is this the Logan of the Rambo franchise? No, it's not. I've parted ways largely with watching John Campia because I think a lot of his stuff anymore. I used to really like Campia. I used to be a huge fan of John Campia, but I think a lot of his stuff anymore is half-baked. I don't know if that is because he's overworking himself or stretching himself too thin, or if he's just too worried about what the YouTube mobs, the Twitter mobs will say about him. So he keeps things really vanilla, or what. But I think that criticism that, is this the Logan of the Rambo franchise? No. I think that's a bit naked. I think that is a bit underwhelming. I think that's a bit half-baked. I think that, look, barring that first movie, and that first movie was golden cinema. I'm not going to... That first movie is, I think, undoubtedly a Hall of Famer, if you want to talk about Hollywood and movies in those terms. That first movie's a Hall of Famer. That first movie's an All-Pro. This movie, I think, is a Pro Bowler. I don't think that necessarily this movie is great. I don't think that necessarily this movie is something that will leave people, a general audience, and I don't speak about the general audience in a condescending term, but I don't think it's something that a general audience is going to talk about for the next 15 years. But what I do believe is that anyone who is a fan of the Rambo franchise is going to see these small touches that like the things that I've talked about, Sylvester Stallone setting the stallions free, etc., and things that I think will pop up later in this review as well. This is the Logan of the Rambo franchise. This is not to say that this movie is on Logan's level. It is to say, I believe, without Logan being made, this movie doesn't get made. I believe that 100% wholeheartedly. That is not to say that this is not the Logan of the Rambo franchise. It is not to say that this is not the Logan of the Rambo franchise to suggest and observe that this movie is not as good as Logan. You've still got the cowboy dying alone, which arguably in Logan that happens. I understand that he's holding his daughter's hand. He's surrounded by children. He's the last one fighting the battle. So say what you will about that. He largely dies alone. I think that it is more than fair to die, if you're dying in a group of children, to say you die alone. To say that you're the last fighter standing. Rambo dies alone in vengeful fashion for the sake of the next generation. The next generation because of a young woman that he accepted into his heart and to a large extent let down. Both Logan and this incarnation of Rambo have that running through them. Now, I did not expect Gabrielle's character to die. I thought that was a nice touch. I think that is one of the small touches that gives Rambo a nod over something like Logan in the non-sentimental department. Which is not to discredit Look, Logan is quite possibly my favorite movie of all time. And a movie that inexplicably I made the mistake of seeing for the first time alone, which that's a gut punch, by the way. Anyway, moving on. This movie, and maybe this is a credit, maybe this is a detraction, I can't make my mind up. This movie felt 60 minutes long. I had no idea when it was over that it was 100 minutes long. It felt like an hour. It was over an hour and a half. I have no idea how that was pulled off. I have no idea how that happened. I know I didn't fall asleep, but that is something that was confusing to me. And I think what it is indicative of is, again, I've said many times, this is not a great movie. This movie is not a Hall of Famer. This movie is not great, but it is great at what it does. And that's all that is necessary to make a movie feel shorter than it is, than longer than it is. And so I'll take an extreme example, Watchmen. Watchmen is a long movie that feels, if you're engaged, Watchmen is a long movie that feels long, but it feels shorter than it is. And I say that remembering full well that when I saw it in the theaters, by the time the movie was over, half the audience had already left. But Watchmen was a long movie that felt shorter than it was because it was good at what it did. Unfortunately, that doesn't help you on a second viewing. I think that this movie being so good at what it does, barring the... I really could have done without the semi-romance between Rambo and the journalist that was never really a romance, but you could almost tell that at some stage of the script it basically had to be. It almost had to be. They're speaking too close to one another's face for this not to at one time have concluded in a kiss. But I think that this movie is so good at what it does that it feels shorter than it really is. And one of the things that it is so good at, and one of the reasons it feels so short, is that final act feels so right. And one of the reasons that it feels so right, and I think this is another thing about the movie that is undersold, things come full circle for the Rambo character. Rambo is a Vietnam War veteran who went over to another country and saw some things that were awful as people were defending their homeland. I think we can agree on that. I think regardless of politics, regardless of whether or not you're supporting this war or that war, regardless of Democrat, Republican, the young men who were shipped off to Vietnam were witness to terrible things, were subject to terrible things, were victims of terrible things as they were trying to do terrible things to other people in their homeland. That is the nature of war. Rarely in American history had war been as ugly as it was in Vietnam. But in this movie, things come full circle as John Rambo is defending his home from invading bad guys with tricks that he witnessed and undoubtedly feared in Vietnam. Now, why would this be so cathartic for someone like John Rambo? John Rambo is someone who felt like a bad guy going to war. That is one of the, I wouldn't say one of the core messages of that first movie, but is definitely one of the things that circles around discussion of the Vietnam War. I spent some time interviewing a Vietnam veteran for one of my classes in community college, and he said that one of the things that was really sort of damning emotionally was that he felt you couldn't absolutely say you were the good guy. And that was something that he struggled with. I think that his generation heard a lot about World War II, and yeah, Americans were the good guys, charging in to save the day. Hoorah! World War I, Americans were the good guys, charging in to save the day. Hoorah! He didn't feel that way with Vietnam. And I think that is one of the things that is... I don't remember that coming up in the first movie. Maybe it did. I'll have to go back and see it. But it is undoubtedly one of the things that people who were familiar with what was going on would have been able to bring to the text. One of the things that would have been injected to that first movie, regardless of what anyone said or thought or did, because it was one of the commentaries about that war in general. So in this movie, when he comes full circle and he is using these agents of fear and destruction, these tools of fear and destruction to completely and nihilistically, not even nihilistically, he's taking joy in this. You can tell he's taking joy in this. And so is the audience. When he's using these tools of fear and destruction to absolutely dismember people, it is a macabre circle that gets closed on the life of John Rambo. I wish in that final scene where he's crawling up on his porch past dead bad guys, which was just a gorgeous touch, I wish that the dialogue in that scene had been a little less melodramatic and a little more focused on the full circle aspect of things. Now he understands, something like that. That is one of my only unfulfilled wishes for this movie. But in that third act, in that long final scene that was the torture of these bad guys, one thing I couldn't help but wish and notice and yearn for, and perhaps this is my own personal bent and no one else will be here with me, that is absolutely how a Batman film should feel. And we've never really been there. Like, obviously, less gore, less blood, less murder. But that feeling of a horror film from the antagonist's point of view is how a Batman film should feel. I'm absolutely interested in your take on this in the comments section, because I'm more than willing to be proven wrong, but I think most people familiar with the Batman character would agree with me. And we mentioned Wolverine a little bit earlier. We mentioned the Logan film a little bit earlier. That's not how a Logan or a Wolverine film should feel. Logan and Wolverine, like, that's more Rambo. The title of the movie is slipping my mind right now, but the previous Rambo, where he's full frontal, in your face. It was just Rambo, wasn't it? I think it was just Rambo. He's just full frontal violent. That's how Wolverine feels. This, sneaking around and instilling fear in the bad guys. This is Batman. And we haven't, I think Zack Snyder tried it a little bit. Christopher Nolan had elements of it. And the original Michael Keaton Batman was willing to tell you that was what was going on. But we never really felt it. This feels like Freddy Krueger from Freddy Krueger's point of view. Using someone's fear against them. I want to see that Batman film. I want to see that Batman movie. Hollywood needs to make it happen. And it's not going to be the most profitable Batman that there ever was. But startlingly, Batman doesn't have that great of a movie financial history. Like, obviously making Legendary loads of money, but especially that first one, that very first Batman, if you look at adjusting for inflation, made massive amounts of money. And it's got a couple in the $1 billion club. The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises were both $1 billion movies. But it's not an automatic home run. And I think that this type of Batman movie you could make for $100 million. This terrifying individual Batman film you could make for $100 million and hit the $1 billion mark. I think you could do that. Maybe that's just an aside. I am sorry for pigeonholing that into a Rambo review, but god damn it. Watching that third act, I wanted to see Batman on the screen, because that's how a Batman film should feel. One opportunity that I think they lost in that third act, man, I think this movie, look, I say this movie's good, not great, this, that, and the other. I think that this could have been Sylvester Stallone's opportunity to change Hollywood one more time. I really do. In that final scene where movie from his era is blaring through an overhead speaker into this torture dungeon that he has built and constructed over a period of years, but finalized in a matter of days. So one of the commentaries there is in basically prepper fashion. He is manipulating the underground to his house, the subconscious of where he lives, into this maze of potential agony. And then, when he's got the excuse to do it, he goes ahead and equips it for full war. That is an amazing commentary on the Rambo character. But I think Sly lost an opportunity to just bend one corner of this thing when he's killed all the other bad guys. And there's music from his era blaring through the speakers into this dungeon of terror that he has constructed, why don't we go full-blown torture porn? Because what you're doing there, all these other torture porn movies that have existed have been to the detriment of the viewer's psyche in the way that they were suffering, right? All of these movies, you are forced or coerced to sort of identify with the individual, at least at first, that is in the chair of being tortured. But here, with music from his era blaring in a dungeon of doom, and he's got the last bad guy, the one most responsible for the death of the only thing that he loved. Not the only thing, maybe, but one of the things that he loved the most in the world, the thing for which he was willing to sacrifice everything else. That much is true. He's got that lone guy running around. We could see full-blown torture porn from the eyes of its creator and root it on. And that would be something, that's a hell of a trick. That is a hell of a trick for a movie maker to pull off, for a movie to empower its audience with that knowledge and those weapons and set them free, to set those stallions running. That could have been great. That could have been amazing. That could have been something that if pulled off, that would have made this movie a Hall of Famer, right? Just that genre bending at the end that puts this thing in full-blown torture porn from the eyes of the bad guy, and you love every second of it. The final note that I have for the discussion on this film, the discussion portion of this review for Rambo Last Blood, is it does make me a little sad to see Sly so old. To almost know, somewhere in the back of your head, this might be the last role, this physical, in which we see Sylvester Stallone. Someone who is without precedence, and maybe without heir. Who's going to take the throne of Sylvester Stallone? Sylvester Stallone is, as much as I really enjoy the Marvel movies and the mythos around them and the action star that has been born of this era of movies, when Chris Hemsworth and Robert Downey Jr. can share a screen together and you don't know who's the scarier one, right? That is a different era for action films. When I was growing up, it would have been Stallone and Arnold, and you weren't sure who was the scarier one, right? So this is a different era, and Stallone is without heir. There is no one taking that mantle. First off, if you don't know the story of Rocky, how the first movie was made and what Sylvester Stallone went through and turned down at what stage in his life, the man literally sold his dog in order to have a little more time pursuing his dream. And then turned down a deal for Rocky as a script because he wanted to star in it, and turned down ungodly amounts of money because they said, no, you don't get to star in it, we'll just buy your script. Several times. The man's a legend. And you're never going to have another Stallone. But to have someone that could fill his shoes in that role, or to fill his shoes as the action star, instead we are left with neither. And that saddens me. Yeah, that's a little sad, I think. And maybe that is sad in a toxic masculinity way, right? Maybe that's how sad this is. I am so toxic that this makes me sad. Anyway, moving on, the final stretch of this review is a rating and recommendation based on the movie itself. It's so hard for me to not give... It's so hard for me... I give this 90 hatchet deaths out of 100 because I just have to. Because it's everything that I wanted from a Rambo movie walking into the theater. Is it an A-level movie? Probably not. It probably isn't. But that third act is so authentically Rambo. Is so much of why I walked into the theater and sat in that chair for those 90 minutes. That I have to give this an A. Is this an A-level movie? Like I said, no, probably not. Probably not. Probably not. But I can't help myself. I have to. It is for someone like me who has looked up to Sylvester Stallone for so long, a movie like this is a lot like when you see a horror fan that gets into just awful horror films and loves them. That's sort of the feeling that this has for me. While and whereas those horror fans would absolutely agree with you, no, Hellraiser's not the finest cinema, but it might be the finest for me. That's sort of what I'm looking at here with this Rambo film. And a recommendation based on the film. Look, I think if you liked this, there was this interesting little torture porn film from the early 90s that gets overlooked a lot in this day and age, that shares a lot of the same things with this movie, especially when you look at this movie as a text. A very unlikable protagonist, fighting for the home, defending one's home, being alone, being so alone in so many aspects of life, being someone who is isolated even when you're around those people that you love. That you have life experiences that separate you from them so drastically that it is indeed fair to say that you are alone. If you enjoy this movie, I really think that you'll like this low-budget torture porn film from the early 90s called Home Alone, starring Macaulay Culkin. And that is what I've got for Rambo. I hope to see you here for the next movie review. I've got several series running on the channel. And I hope that even if you don't agree with me about some things, that you are willing to have that conversation with me as opposed to tuning me out, because there are a lot of things I want to explore on this channel that will undoubtedly rile some people. So, hit that like button if you like this sort of thing. Hit the subscribe button if you're looking forward to more of this type of thing. And if you'd like to help me grow on the channel, it really helps if you press that share button and share this on some form of social media. And again, I hope to see you back for the next video.